Funding for this program is provided in part by Bruce Foods Corporation, makers of the complete line of Cajun King seafood seasoning mixes and other distinctive Louisiana-style food products. Additional funding is provided by the Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism. Anytime, any place. In Louisiana, we're really cooking.
Louisiana. Hi, I'm Chef John Folse, welcoming you to the bayous of South Louisiana. Today, Cajun and Creole cooking holds a prime spot in the world of international cuisine, and I would love for you to know a little bit about it. So why not sit back, relax, and join me and some of my friends as we cook up another great Taste of Louisiana. Again, and welcome to Taste of Louisiana. I'm Chef John Folse, and today we're doing oyster cooking Louisiana style. I don't want anybody to touch that dial and get away from us because I know what you're thinking. Who eats oysters? Everybody in Louisiana eats oysters, and I want you to start eating oysters too. So we're going to show you all kind of great dishes using Louisiana oysters today. And visiting just a little bit later is a great friend of mine, a friend I've been knowing for many, many years, a guy who owns one of the greatest oyster bars in the city of Baton Rouge, but also a guy who knows a lot about cooking oysters, Gus Piazza. So Gus is going to be in, and we're going to cook a little bit and talk about how oysters got into the origin of Louisiana cooking. But first, let's look at oysters a little bit. Do you realize that in the state of Louisiana, we produce about 13 million pounds of oyster meat every year? That's about $50 million worth of oysters. And here we have some of those American oysters. That little shell is open, sucking in about 5 gallons of fresh water. That's where they get their food. Here's an old oyster trawler, and that basket is just scraping up or dredging up all of these nice oysters right out of the Gulf. This guy is separating oysters because oysters grow in clusters in Louisiana waters, and you need to take that little hatchet and separate them so you can get the oysters shell for shell, just like these guys are doing, pouring this 1.5 bushels into about I guess it's about a 75-pound croaker sack. We used to get oysters 100-pound sacks, but I guess they got too heavy to carry. An oyster shucker. I guess this might be over at Gus Piazza's place. Boy, I tell you, oysters on the half shell, one of my favorite dishes. I love oysters, and I know you're going to like oysters too as soon as we finish cooking up some of them here as we experience another Taste of Louisiana. Let's talk about oysters for a second. Look at the way we get them here in Louisiana. I've got right here oysters that's been shucked. Now we have, you see the size of these oysters, they look mighty big, but this oyster is about 3 years old, and when they get 3 years old, 2.5 to 3 years old, we have an oyster that's about 2.5 to 3 inches long. This oyster can also be male or female. It's kind of convenient, I guess, but it lays about 10 million eggs a year, so we're going to have oysters in Louisiana waters for a long, long time. The oysters come to us, as you saw, in the shell. Sometimes they're clustered and you have to break them apart, but once you open this shell, you've got a delicacy unlike anything else in the whole country. When we get oysters in the restaurant industry of Louisiana, we normally get them in these gallon tubs, and in this gallon tub right here, we'll have probably about 125 to 130 select oysters, all packed in their own liquid, so we can be ensured that we're going to have a great, great oyster. About 40% of all of the oysters that's eaten in the country today comes through aquaculture. So you can be sure that when you get oysters, half of them are going to be great. So you have to be sure where you're getting oysters from. But it's just like anything else. You have to make sure that your supplier is reputable, and then you can be assured of great seafood, meats, vegetables, or anything else. I'll tell you a lot more about oysters, but first, let's cook up a great oyster dish, a dish that's got a lot of tradition in Louisiana. This dish is oyster and artichoke soup. And I'm going to begin by putting a little butter. Let me kick this fire up on my black iron pot. Make sure this thing's good and hot here, because I want to get good heat. I'm going to put a little buttery flavored oil into the pot. Again, use whatever you want to use as far as oils are concerned. I always like the buttery flavored oils. And I'm going to put it in the pot and get it real nice and hot, and we're going to start off by putting in all the flavors of Louisiana. One of the things that I really like about oysters is when I think of the history of it. Do you know that the Greeks and Romans were eating oysters 2,000 or 3,000 years ago? And in China, a great industry was cultivated about the time they were building the Great Wall. So oysters have been a part of our culture for many thousands of years. But it was actually the Acadians of Louisiana that developed the oyster industry here in our own state. I'm going to start off by putting a little onions, celery, bell pepper, all of the great flavorings of Louisiana, the Trinity, as we call it here in the bayous. We always begin our dishes, of course, with a lot of fresh vegetable seasonings. That ensures that the final product is going to be great. Always a lot of garlic. Whenever we cook oysters, we always do a lot of garlic. Fact is, fresh oysters on the half shell, a little hot sauce, and a little squeeze of garlic will always make that oyster a lot better. Now, I'll stir this around into the pot. How nice all those flavors come together here in this buttery flavored oil. Stir that around. And then we'll put one of the main ingredients, artichokes. And where did this recipe develop in Louisiana? Well, it's interesting because I've got a great friend of mine who's a chef in the city of New Orleans on the west bank of the river, a guy by the name of Warren LaRue. And Warren was famous for his oyster and artichoke soup in the city of New Orleans for years and years and years. And people would drive in from all over the country just to have this oyster and artichoke soup. And I asked Warren one day, where did the recipe originate? And he said, well, he had gone to visit his mother-in-law, or his mother-in-law-to-be when he was courting his wife, and she had a wonderful oyster soup that was flavored with artichokes, and it was an Italian dish, he felt, but he came back to the restaurant, tried to attempt the recipe for 2 or 3 times, couldn't get it right, so his mother-in-law came in and did the oyster and artichoke soup for him, and it's been a tradition at LaRue's restaurant on the West Bank ever since. A great dish. Now, I'm going to put in about 6 or 7 of these pretty oysters because I want to get the flavor in there. The oysters are about 90% water, so instantly they're going to start to generate that great oyster liquor into the artichokes and seasonings, onions, celery, bell pepper. Really nice. The smell of this is just wonderful. And then, of course, I'll have to thicken, so I'll sprinkle in just a little bit flour, just enough, again, to pick up the butters, because this is a cream-based soup. But the flavor is yet to come into the pot, because I've got a surprise for you as to where the great flavor is going to come from in this soup. Not only the fresh oysters and the artichokes, and look how that butter, butter and flour comes together to make the nice roux in the bottom of the pot. See how nice that is? Now for the great flavor. I'm going to actually enter into this soup pot a fresh oyster stock. This stock is 100% oyster liquor, right out of the oyster shells. Now, I normally ask my seafood supplier to retain about 1 gallon of oyster liquor for me every week to make sure that I have enough oyster liquor to make my oyster stews and oyster soups. And you can imagine how much oyster flavor is in this pot now with 100% oyster liquor, as it's called. Not oyster liquid, but oyster liquor. Look how nice that is. The oysters will now start to allow all that fresh juice to flavor the soup. And I'll blend that in just a little bit. And I'll finish it with heavy whipping cream. Look how nice this is. Imagine the great flavors in this pot with the garlics and onions and celery and the artichokes, of course, from the Italian side of our cooking. A little bit heavy whipping cream. As much as you would like, but I normally put a couple cups just to change the color because I don't want the cream to actually take away from the flavor of the oyster or dilute the oyster flavor. I just want to make sure that the cream smooths it out and gives it a nice rich flavor. Now into that, a little more color. We always want to put some color in, so a little red bell pepper, a little golden bell pepper, just like that. Fresh green onions, more green onions, and then some fresh parsley. I'm going to season with a touch of Louisiana pepper sauce, just 2 or 3 little shots, and a touch of salt. But you have to remember that oysters are naturally very salty. So make sure that you're very cautious as you put salt into a fresh oyster dish, test the oysters first to make sure that they're just the right salinity so that you don't over-season your dish. Isn't this nice? Look at that beautiful pot. Now, I'm going to allow this to cook for just a couple minutes, and I'm going to move it off to the fire here in the back, my little burner, and let that simmer for a second while I create for you another great, great tradition in Louisiana. One of the, I guess, dishes that most people in the world know Louisiana for, and that's Oysters Rockefeller. And Oysters Rockefeller, I guess, is a dish that most oyster dishes on the half shell has been trying to emulate for years and years all over the world, not only here in the United States. Oysters Rockefeller originated in the city of New Orleans in the late 1800s at Antoine's restaurant. And it was created by Jules Alsator, the guy who actually opened the restaurant in the late 1800s. And Jules created Oysters Rockefeller and named it after the Rockefeller family because they thought the dish was so rich and tasty. So that's where the Rockefeller name comes from. And I'm going to lower the fire on my black skillet for just a second because there's a lot of fallacies around the world as to exactly what are the ingredients in Oysters Rockefeller. So I'm going to start off and show you exactly what we do today. I'm going to start again, of course, with a little, this butter-flavored oil. And I'm going to introduce into the pot all of the greenery because you know when you look at Oysters Rockefeller, it looks like all spinach or all green in the pot, but that's not necessarily true. We start off with a lot of fresh bell pepper, all green going in. A lot of fresh chopped green onions, again, green into the pot. Now, you know I like a lot of color, so I'm starting off with all green here today, and I'm going to have to come back and add just a little touch of color. I'll stir that around for a second. How these old black skillets really cook nice and hot, so we want to make sure that we continue to stir so that we don't burn the seasonings. And then into that, I want to show you this great, beautiful bowl here with all the fresh greens of Louisiana. You can see I have some fresh spinach leaves and a different kind of spinach here, a little broadleaf spinach plant. And I've taken the fresh spinach and actually poached it off already. And as it was cooked, I chopped it up nice and even so that I can mix it in and break it right in to create the sauce of the Oysters Rockefeller. So I'll put a couple nice handfuls of the chopped spinach right into the green onions and parsley. I'm going to put green onions and, bell pepper. I'll add parsley later, and I'll stir that right on in. You can see, again, all green Rockefeller money, the color of money. So this is all going into the skillet. And then I'll add fresh chopped oysters because I want oyster flavor right down into the dish. And, of course, another one of the great dishes of Louisiana, which originated, again, in the city of New Orleans, is Oysters Bienville, named after one of the founders of the city and a guy who rode up and down the Mississippi River. But Oysters Bienville is the rival to this dish. It really isn't a dish as popular as Oysters Rockefeller in the city of New Orleans. And then, to keep it nice and moist, I'm going to add a little bit of the oyster stock, because we definitely want to make this dish nice and moist. It'll become a stuffing. Continue to move this around in the skillet. And then I'll add the garlic to it because we want to have nice, fresh garlic down into it, and a lot of garlic because in the city of New Orleans, the Italians, a big, big Italian culture, and they actually brought into the city the need for a lot of flavor in garlic, coming out of old French market where everybody used to go to sell their vegetables every day. Okay, again, a little bit more stock. We want to continue to keep this Oysters Rockefeller sauce nice and moist. There you are. When talking about Louisiana oysters, or talking about the oyster industry in the state of Louisiana, most of our oysters today, as I said, are coming out of aquaculture. We're taking beds along the Gulf of Mexico and sectioning those beds off, and the state is making sure that the water conditions are nice and clear and clean to make sure that we're getting good, safe oysters. We have a great oyster bar business here in the city of New Orleans and around Baton Rouge, and unless we can be ensured of a great oyster supply year in and year out, we're going to have to shut those bars down, and that's just not going to happen. The Cajuns of Louisiana would never allow that to take place. So the state has come in to ensure that we have great inspections of oysters, and aquaculture, producing about 40% of all of the oysters that's being consumed in Louisiana today, is ensuring that we will have a good supply of oysters for a long, long time. The important thing, I think, is that whether it's oysters, seafood, meats, vegetables, it's important that we as consumers know full well where our supplies are coming from, because unless we're safe that our supplies are coming from reputable suppliers, who knows what we're going to be getting, whether it's oysters or anything else. So don't concern yourself about quality, concern yourself about where is the source, where is it coming from. Okay, to finish this, I'm going to put in now a little tomato sauce. Now the tomato sauce will help hold it all together in the dish. And some people use ketchup because they want a little sweet taste. Of course, I'm going to add now the color, little red bell pepper, a little golden bell pepper. And again, many recipes call for a little flour at this point, dusting in just a little flour to hold it all together. Look at the colors, how beautiful that is. Now I'm going to dust in just a little flour into the dish, and this will actually help bind all of the spinach stuffing together. So I'll stir this in just like that, and then I'll add a touch of heavy whipping cream, and the whipping cream will almost make a little white sauce down into the bottom of the dish. And I add just a touch of whipping cream, not too much. There you are, and that'll create a little white sauce into the bottom of the black iron skillet. How nice that is. And then breadcrumbs, a little Italian breadcrumbs. This will add the Italian flavor in, but will also help to bind the stuffing. So I'll mix that right on in. And then, of course, we always flavor the oysters Rockefeller with herb saint or Pernod or one of those great licorice flavored liqueurs out of the city. And oysters Rockefeller always use herb saint. And I'm going to put just a little touch of herb saint down into the dish. This will give you that licorice flavor that you always taste when you eat oysters Rockefeller. And then, of course, the seasoning, a little touch of Louisiana pepper sauce and a little touch of Worcestershire sauce, and then we can stuff the oyster right at this point. So I've got some really nice oysters here. I've already poached them on the half shell. You can see how nice that looks. And we put them on rock salt because when they go into the oven, we want to make sure that they stay nice and steady on the baking dish. But we'll take the Rockefeller sauce that's been flavored with the oyster stock, the chopped oysters, the garlic, all those nice green onions and bell pepper, red and golden bell pepper, and a touch of Louisiana pepper sauce, and herb saint for that great classical New Orleans flavor. And we'll mix that in just like that. So that's a couple of the dishes that we'll do. This will go into the oven, of course, and bake for about 10 minutes. The oysters are poached, so we want to make sure that they come nice and hot when we bring them to the table. Just like that, a beautiful dish from the early Antoine's restaurant of the city of New Orleans. I'll put this out of the way. Of course, we have a lot of different dishes that we do. We have rice stuffings and dressings and all of those nice things that we do with oysters, but I want to introduce you right now to a guy who's a great friend of mine, and we're going to talk a little bit more about oysters. I told you Gus Piazza was a great oyster shucker and a great restaurateur in the city of Baton Rouge, and I can hear those oyster knives coming down the hallway right now. Hey, Gus.
Hey, John.
How you doing?
Fine. How you doing?
Man, good to see you.
I hadn't seen you, man. Where you been?
Man, working.
Come on,
like all Cajuns.
I understand. You always come to the restaurant, you love oysters, and since I hadn't seen you, I figured I better come see you and bring you some oysters.
You brought me some?
I brought you some oysters.
And I see you have your oyster knife and your little lead.
Yeah.
You know what I want you to do? Gus is one of the greatest oyster shuckers in Louisiana. I want you to put that oyster knife right here and shuck me an oyster. I want you to show all my friends out here how we in Louisiana shuck oysters. How have you been?
Been fine. I know you love oysters, and all you do is get the finished product, so I want to teach you how to shuck them in case you want to shuck them yourself.
This is good American oysters, too. These are that's about 100 species of oysters, I know, but this is the American oyster, which is the best.
Right. Of course, they come out of Louisiana waters, which we're prejudiced. You know, we think we have the best. And,
that makes it the best, right?
Yeah, but I just like to show you and let you taste some raw oysters.
Hey, let me see how it's done.
All right. Basically, John, we take the oyster knife. We have a lid that we put the oyster on for safety purposes, and we stick the knife into the oyster, into the beak of the front part of the oyster. And you get in, you pop the oyster open. And as you see, the oyster is opened up. They got some juices run out. That's to ensure that the oyster is fresh.
If that juice comes out, we know it's good.
That's right. Absolutely. If the juice comes out, you put it in your hand, thumb up. You slide the knife down the oyster. You continue to open the oyster. Now, the oyster has what they call an eye.
Pop that thing. Pop that thing, man. I can't wait to get at that oyster. Huh?
There's a Louisiana fresh oyster.
It's got the eye right there, and that's what you cut.
You cut the eye out, and it's suitable for eating.
I can't wait. I can't wait. You don't mind if I put a little hot sauce on this?
No, absolutely.
I'm going to put a little touch of hot sauce right on top of that oyster, and I'm going to dip right on in, and this is the way we do it in Louisiana.
That's the only way.
Thank you. Hey, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Show
How
me
about
one
another
fast.
one? Yeah.
One fast one, real fast.
You
know what we want to do? You know what I'm going to do while you're shucking this? You and I both do a dish. Let me throw a little more of that hot sauce on top of it. Maybe a little touch of that garlic. You know I like garlic. You and I have to sit here and stand here and talk to each other. Now you got to put up with garlic and hot sauce.
There you go. How's that?
Nice and salty.
Yeah, excellent taste.
Really nice and salty. Let me tell you what I want to do.
All right.
You have a dish in your restaurant. I have a dish in my restaurant called Oyster Po-boys.
All right.
Oyster Po-boys is probably one of the most famous oyster sandwiches in Louisiana.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of put an oyster po-boy together, and then I want to talk a little bit more about oysters. So we're going to move this out of the way, and I'm going to give you the po-boy bread. Because the po-boy bread is, let me wipe this counter down for you here. Boy, I tell you what, you oyster shuckers sure know how to make a mess, huh?
That's part of the oysters.
That's part of it. Okay, now I'm going to give you these nice fresh tomatoes here.
Beautiful Creole tomatoes,
Isn't that beautiful?
God,
great Creole. Then a little mayonnaise and Creole mustards. And
Creole
I know when you put the po-boys together, you put a lot of different stuff on them. So I want you to go ahead and put those together while we actually sit here and fry up a couple of these oysters. Now, what I'm going to do while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and take some of these nice oysters and put them down into an egg wash. And the egg wash is just a little milk, a little one egg, and then, of course, a little bit water. I'll put about 3 or 4 of them down in here. And, Gus, I know there's as many recipes for these fried oyster po-boys as there are cooks who cook them, but I always do mine with the egg wash and then into yellow corn flour. How do y'all do yours at the restaurant?
Well, we don't use the egg white. We feel like the oysters being so much moisture, we just take them right to the yellow corn flour and salt and pepper the batter and drop them in the oil.
Well, I find that by dipping them in the egg wash first, we get a really, really nice crisp outside. The egg kind of holds the batter together, and that's why I do it. But, of course, I've had your oyster po-boys, and I'll tell you, they're absolutely fantastic.
We sell a couple of oysters every day.
You know, talking about selling a couple of oysters, I was in your back door the other day, and the tons of oyster shells. How many oysters do y'all go through in a year?
Well, we go through about 60, 65 tons a year, use about 35, 40 sacks a week, and we have a couple shells there.
I guarantee you. Oyster Po-boys. I'll tell you where it gets its name from. People call them submarines. People call them different kind of sandwiches. But in Louisiana, we call them po-boys because in the old days, the kids used to run down the street going to work or school with a loaf of bread in their back pocket about 10 inches sticking out. And people would say, oh, look at those po folks.
That's all they could afford.
That's all they could afford was bread. So the little bitty bread became known as po-boy bread. Now that you have the bread, what do you have on that bread now?
Oh, we have a little combination of the mayonnaise with the hot mustard, beautiful Creole tomatoes, and a little ketchup, a little horseradish sauce in there.
Well, now let me go ahead and put the oysters on. It just takes a couple minutes for the oysters to fry, not very long at all. And you can position them right on there. And then...
Oh, they're beautiful.
Aren't they beautiful? Look how nice and plump these oysters are. How can anybody in the world be afraid to eat nice, fresh oysters? If only you know where they're coming from and that you're real nice and safe knowing that your oyster supplier is giving you a real quality product. Now I'm going to give you a knife.
little knife.
To cut that po' in half.
All right.
And you can see just how nice and crispy those oysters were as they started to come out of the frying skillet. Those things are just beautiful. What we have here is an oyster po' in the early days in Louisiana. Gus, we would actually take the French bread and take some of the wild mushrooms that we would find in the woods, the wild oyster mushrooms. They had a great oyster flavor. And then we would put them in corn flour, just like this, a little mushroom, put them on French bread, and they would actually mimic the flavor of fresh oysters. And we would do oyster mushroom po' all the time and think that we were eating fresh oyster po'
Country boys didn't know any better. That's why us city boys know a little bit more.
Yeah, all New Orleans boys were eating the wrong, y'all were eating the right thing. We were eating the wrong thing. They were faking us out in the bayous. Hey, but nothing will ever substitute a good oyster po' of the city of New Orleans. Because I can't tell you how much I appreciate you stopping by and showing me how to shuck an oyster and helping me fry a little po' and all of that. And why don't we just...
Can I have a bite?
Why don't you go ahead and bite into that thing and see if I did a good job, huh? Look how juicy that Creole tomato is. Is it any good?
Oysters are sweet.
Normally
too.
you have to have towels on your arm to keep the juices from the oysters going down your arm. But I'm going to come by and see you at the oyster bar, get you to shuck me a few oysters.
Have a little bite there,
I am going to bite right into this. And I hope y'all enjoyed watching us cook oysters, and I want you to come back and visit us next time as we continue to cook up more great Taste of Louisiana. It's po' boy time.
This is delicious. Nothing better here, son.
Funding for this program was provided in part by Bruce Foods Corporation, makers of Bruce's Yams and other distinctive Louisiana-style food products. Additional funding is provided by the Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism. Anytime, any place. In Louisiana, we're really cooking.
The companion cookbook to A Taste of Louisiana is available for $22.95. The Evolution of Cajun and Creole Cuisine by Chef John Folse features recipes and food history behind Louisiana's cuisine. This 352-page cookbook contains over 250 recipes, including those from this show. To order, call 1-800-973-7246 or write to the address on your screen.